All right. Well, we're ready for another fun social studies lesson today. And today we're kind of looking at a little side note to the War of 1812. We're going to look specifically at some details about that battle at New Orleans, or really about Andrew Jackson. So I'm going to read a text with you today, and you can read it on your own too. It's called The Revenge of the Dirty Shirts. Revenge of the Dirty Shirts. It's a story about some guys from Tennessee and in the Battle of New Orleans. And so I think you'll enjoy this text. And then we'll have some questions at the end, but it's a little different from the textbook for sure. It gives a lot of details that your textbook doesn't give. So let's get into this text, The Revenge of the Dirty Shirts. So again, this is one of those where I'm going to read it with you, but if you would like to read it on your own, it's on the next 4 slides. The War of 1812 mainly played out in the northeast United States, but there were 2 important chapters in the war that involved Tennesseans. During the War of 1812, the British encouraged Native Americans to fight against the United States and gave them weapons. Native Americans were also encouraged to fight the Shawnee. They were to fight by the Shawnee chief Tecumseh. Remember, we read about him in our social studies book. He tried to unite all the Indian tribes to fight against the settlers. Partly because of these things, a branch of the Creek Nation known as the Red Sticks attacked American forts in present-day Alabama. At Fort Sims, about 1,000 Red Sticks killed an estimated 250 settlers. Tennessee sent its militia, led by General Andrew Jackson, to defeat the Red Sticks. Jackson's army of about 3,300 men fought them at a bend in the Tallapoosa River called Horseshoe Bend. The Red Sticks had a line of defense in front of them and the river behind them. Jackson's men attacked and overwhelmed the Red Sticks, who were driven into the river. During the day's fighting at the Horseshoe Bend, about 50 members of Jackson's army were killed. About 800 Red Sticks died, the largest death toll for Native Americans in a single battle in American history. So many Red Sticks died trying to cross the Tallapoosa River that the river ran red in places. Why do you think it ran red? It was from their blood, wasn't it? There were Native Americans on both sides of this battle. Among the men who fought in General Jackson's army were several hundred Cherokee warriors. One of them, a chief named Junaluska, claimed to have saved Jackson's life at Horseshoe Bend. Sam Houston was one of the Tennesseans who fought at Horseshoe Bend. Houston was both shot and hit with an arrow during the battle. So he got shot and he got shot with a bow and arrow, both a gun and an arrow. He's a pretty tough guy. Another guy from Tennessee. Today, the only soldier buried on the battlefield is Lemuel Montgomery. Montgomery, Alabama is named for him. The slaughter at New Orleans. A few months after Horseshoe Bend, 15,000 British troops invaded Louisiana. These were experienced soldiers who'd previously fought Napoleon. They were so confident that their admiral said he intended to give the Americans a complete drubbing. The U.S. government ordered General Andrew Jackson's army to defend New Orleans. Jackson's army marched down the Natchez Trace, then to New Orleans. They set up at a sugar plantation about 5 miles south of the city. Jackson chose a narrow stretch of land with the Mississippi River on one side and a swamp on the other. He ordered his men to dig a ditch and build a rampart behind it, like a wall. They waited for the British to attack, which came on January 8th, 1815. On paper, this looked like a mismatch for the British. Jackson's army was outnumbered 3-1, and his army wasn't a cohesive unit. About 1,300 of them were militiamen from Tennessee, some of whom fought at Horseshoe Bend. He had a few hundred soldiers from the U.S. Army. He had Louisiana militiamen, many of whom spoke French and Spanish, but not English. He had 62 Choctaw Indians. He had a group of privateers from Louisiana known as Bovatarians. Jackson had also nearly 500 free black men fighting for him at New Orleans. In fact, this was the largest use of African-American soldiers in an American battle until the Civil War. The British had more soldiers, more experienced soldiers, and better trained soldiers. But at New Orleans, British troops charged into a well-entrenched army. Also, their leaders made terrible mistakes planning for the battle. For instance, at the beginning of the day, a large British force crossed the Mississippi River intending to fire guns across the river at the American lines. But they didn't realize how strong the current of the river was. The crossing took hours longer than it was supposed to. When the main battle began, the British assumed that the weak point of the American line were the dirty shirts. There comes the title. Who were the dirty shirts? They were men from Tennessee and Kentucky who didn't have a real uniform. However, many of these dirty shirts had fought together for years and were great soldiers. They were hunters too, probably from Tennessee on the frontier, weren't they? As the British soldiers marched toward them, they were mowed down by the dirty shirts, who were led by Tennessee Generals Coffee and Carroll, for whom Coffee and Carroll counties are named, both counties in Tennessee. Finally, the ladders and bases that the British soldiers had intended to use to climb the ramparts never got to the front lines. Soldiers who advanced close to the lines found that they had no way of climbing the rampart. Remember, the rampart is the wall that was built in front of the American soldiers. Hundreds died standing in formation, waiting for the ladders that never came. Andrew Jackson's army crushed the British in the Battle of New Orleans. It was one of the most lopsided battles in history. More than 2,000 British soldiers were killed, wounded, captured, or missing. The Americans only lost about 20 men in the main battle. The British and American soldiers later learned that the peace treaty ending the War of 1812 had already been signed before the Battle of New Orleans. You see, in those days, it took a long time for news to be delivered. However, many people believe that the lopsided nature of this battle ensured that the British would never fight a war against the United States again. The battle made General Andrew Jackson a national hero. His leadership in the battle had a lot to do with why he was elected president in 1828. For many years, January 8th was celebrated as a national holiday in the United States. Finally, the Battle of New Orleans gave Tennesseans a reputation for toughness that they still have. The Jackson Purchase. The Creek Indians lost their land in Alabama as a result of the War of 1812. Shortly after that, the U.S. government negotiated the purchase of what is now West Tennessee from the Chickasaw Indian Nation. The purchase of West Tennessee is often referred to as the Jackson Purchase, since Andrew Jackson was the main representative of the U.S. government. White settlers moved in quickly into West Tennessee, creating one of America's first land rushes. 3 Nashville businessmen, Jackson, James Winchester, and James Overton, thought they could make money by creating a new town on the Mississippi River. They named it Memphis, after a famous city in ancient Egypt. Memphis soon developed into a place where cotton grown in West Tennessee would be packed into boats bound for St. Louis to the north and New Orleans to the south. So who were those dirty shirts? Who got the revenge? It was the tough fighters from Tennessee and Kentucky. They didn't have uniforms. They just wore old dirty shirts because they were in a war. But they were tough guys that kicked the British butt at New Orleans. All right, you got a few questions to answer about this text. Go do it now.